96% of all species on Earth were once wiped out in a single event. Not most species, not the majority. 96%, meaning that for every 100 types of living things in the ocean the day before, only 4 were still alive afterward. That event was the Permian extinction 252 million years ago, and it's the most catastrophic thing that has ever happened to complex life on this planet. It's also one of 5. 5 times in the past 500 million years, the ocean and the land have experienced mass extinctions so severe that the world that existed afterward was almost unrecognizable from the one that existed before. The history of life on Earth is not a story of steady, uninterrupted progress. It's a story of long periods of relative stability, punctuated by sudden, catastrophic collapses, each one followed by a slow and extraordinary rebuilding from whatever scraps of life remained. The word extinction is familiar enough, but mass extinction is a specific scientific concept with a specific meaning. Scientists define a mass extinction as an event in which more than 75% of all species on Earth disappear within a geologically short time frame. That threshold distinguishes mass extinctions from the background rate of extinction that happens all the time as species come and go in response to normal environmental pressures. Species going extinct is not unusual. It's part of how evolution works. What's unusual is the wholesale collapse of biological diversity across multiple different groups at the same time, faster than evolution can replace what's been lost. The 5 mass extinctions are named primarily for the geological time periods they ended. The end Ordovician extinction, around 443 million years ago. The late Devonian extinction, around 375 to 359 million years ago. The end Permian extinction, around 252 million years ago, which is the largest of the 5 and the one scientists call the Great Dying. The end Triassic extinction, around 201 million years ago, and the end Cretaceous extinction, around 66 million years ago, which killed the non-avian dinosaurs. Together, these 5 events have shaped the history of life on Earth more profoundly than any other force, except perhaps the original appearance of complex life itself. For the ocean specifically, mass extinctions have been both devastating and generative. Devastating because the species lost in each event are gone forever, and the ecological communities they were part of collapse with them. But generative because each extinction created enormous ecological opportunity. When the dominant species of an era are swept away, the survivors can diversify into the vacated spaces, producing new body plans, new ecological relationships, and new solutions to the problem of survival in ways that wouldn't have been possible, while the old order was still in place. This episode walks through all 5 extinctions, what caused each one, what it destroyed, and what it left behind. It then looks at what the patterns of mass extinction can tell us about what makes life resilient and what they can tell us about the present moment. When many scientists are arguing that the ocean is in the early stages of a 6th mass extinction, driven not by volcanism or asteroid impact, but by human activity. Whether that argument is correct is one of the most important scientific and policy questions of our time, and the history of the 5 previous extinctions is the best context we have for evaluating it. One more thing worth establishing at the outset: the 5 mass extinctions are not equally severe. They range from events that eliminated roughly 75% of species to one that eliminated around 96%. They were caused by a remarkable variety of mechanisms, from glaciation to volcanism to asteroid impact, which tells us something important about how vulnerable complex life is to disruption, not just from any single cause, but from virtually any rapid change in the fundamental conditions of the environment. Understanding mass extinctions also means accepting something counterintuitive about the nature of biological progress. We tend to think of evolution as building steadily toward greater complexity and diversity. Mass extinctions reveal that this progress is punctuated by catastrophic reversals that set the whole system back and force it to start again. The world we have today isn't the end point of a smooth progression. It's the current state of a recovery that's been running for 66 million years. The first of the 5 mass extinctions struck at the end of the Ordovician period, around 443 million years ago, and it's in some ways the most puzzling of the 5 because it came in 2 distinct pulses rather than a single catastrophic event. The Ordovician Ocean was a rich and diverse world dominated by nautiloids, trilobites, brachiopods, early corals, and a wide variety of other invertebrate life. Then, in a relatively short period by geological standards, roughly 85% of all marine species went extinct. The first pulse appears to have been caused by a rapid and severe glaciation. The supercontinent that existed at the time was positioned over the South Pole, and it developed a large ice sheet very quickly. As ice expanded on land, water was removed from the ocean in enormous quantities, and sea levels dropped dramatically. The shallow coastal seas, where most Ordovician marine life was concentrated, were among the first habitats to disappear, and the species that lived in those habitats had no time to relocate before their environment vanished. The cooling of the ocean that accompanied the glaciation was itself a major killer. The Ordovician Ocean had been warm, and the organisms that lived in it were adapted to warm conditions. A rapid temperature drop of several degrees is enough to push many species past the limits of their physiological tolerance. The combination of habitat loss from falling sea levels and thermal stress from cooling water produced the first wave of mass extinction. Then, almost immediately in geological terms, things reversed. The ice melted, sea levels rose again, and the ocean warmed back up. But the second pulse of extinction proved just as deadly as the first, for the opposite reasons. The rapid warming that followed the glaciation reduced oxygen levels in the ocean, disrupted circulation patterns, and created conditions that were lethal to many of the species that had survived the initial cooling. It was an extinction that killed both on the way down and on the way back up. What survived the end Ordovician extinction was a reduced but still diverse community of marine life. Trilobites lost many of their species but weren't eliminated. Cephalopods survived and would diversify into the ammonites that dominated Mesozoic seas. Brachiopods persisted, as did many of the early reef-building organisms. The extinction reset the Ordovician Ocean without erasing it entirely, and the Silurian world that followed was, in some respects, a reorganized version of the Ordovician rather than something completely new. The end Ordovician extinction also holds an important place in the story of reef systems. The Ordovician had seen the development of the first substantial reef communities built by stromatoporoids, tabulate corals, and other colonial organisms. The extinction devastated them. Most of the reef-building organisms that had characterized the Ordovician died out, and the reefs themselves collapsed. The Silurian world that followed eventually produced new reef communities, but they were built by different organisms and had a different character from the Ordovician reefs they replaced. Each mass extinction represents not just the loss of individual species, but the erasure of entire ecological architectures that had taken millions of years to develop. The end Ordovician extinction is also notable for being one of the most rapid of the five. While the late Devonian extinction played out across tens of millions of years, the end Ordovician appears to have been relatively swift, perhaps within 1 million years or less in geological terms. The two pulses of glaciation and warming followed each other quickly enough that species that had barely begun to recover from the first were hit almost immediately by the second. Speed of environmental change, as the 5 mass extinctions collectively demonstrate, is often as important as the magnitude of that change in determining how much life survives. Each mass extinction, in this way, was also the ocean rewriting its own rulebook. The late Devonian extinction is the most complicated of the 5 to describe, partly because it wasn't a single event, but a prolonged crisis that played out across roughly 25 million years, from about 375 to 359 million years ago. There were multiple extinction pulses within this period, the most severe of which occurred around 372 million years ago in an event called the Kellwasser event, and again at the very end of the Devonian in an event called the Hagenberg event. Together, these pulses eliminated roughly 75% of all species on Earth and fundamentally restructured both the marine and terrestrial biosphere. The Devonian Ocean was a particularly rich one. The great reef systems of the Devonian, built by stromatoporoids and tabulate corals, were among the most extensive the ocean had produced to that point. Placoderms dominated the predator role in the water column. The ocean was full of ammonites, trilobites, brachiopods, and a wide variety of other invertebrate life. All of this was substantially dismantled by the late Devonian extinction, and the reef systems in particular were essentially eliminated and would not be rebuilt to comparable complexity for millions of years. The causes of the late Devonian extinction are still actively debated, and it's likely that multiple factors contributed. One of the most compelling hypotheses involves the forests. During the Devonian, trees appeared on land for the first time, and the spread of forests had a dramatic impact on the global carbon cycle. Tree roots break up rock much more efficiently than earlier land plants, accelerating the chemical weathering that pulls carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. The sudden extraction of large amounts of CO2 from the air would have cooled the climate and altered ocean chemistry, potentially triggering the glaciation episodes associated with the extinction pulses. The spread of forests also dramatically increased the amount of organic material washing into the ocean from rivers, fertilizing coastal waters in ways that led to massive algal blooms. When those blooms died and sank to the seafloor, bacteria decomposing them consumed enormous amounts of oxygen from the water, creating large dead zones where almost nothing could survive. This process, called ocean anoxia, appears to have been a major killer in the late Devonian, particularly for organisms living in shallow coastal waters. The reef communities of the Devonian were devastated by this combination of cooling, anoxia, and disrupted ocean chemistry. The Hangenberg event at the very end of the Devonian was the final blow. It appears to have involved a rapid glaciation followed by equally rapid warming, echoing the two-pulse pattern of the end Ordovician extinction. Placoderms, which had dominated the Devonian Ocean for over 60 million years, went completely extinct at the Hangenberg event. Not a single species survived into the Carboniferous. The sharks that had been sharing the ocean with them did survive and moved into the ecological space the placoderms left behind. The late Devonian extinction also had a profound effect on vertebrate evolution beyond the loss of the placoderms. The lobe-finned fish that were making tentative excursions onto land during the Devonian, the group that includes Tiktaalik, were among the survivors, and the tetrapods that descended from them went on to colonize the land far more completely in the Carboniferous than would have been possible while the Devonian fish fauna was intact. The extinction that devastated the ocean also, indirectly, accelerated the conquest of the land. The late Devonian extinction also illustrates something important about the relationship between land and sea that runs through the entire history of mass extinctions. The ocean and the terrestrial world aren't separate systems. They're deeply connected, with changes on land affecting the ocean and changes in the ocean affecting life on land. The forest hypothesis for the late Devonian extinction is a striking example of this connection. Plants evolving on land triggered changes in ocean chemistry that devastated marine ecosystems. Understanding mass extinctions requires understanding the Earth as a single interconnected system. The end Permian extinction is in a category of its own. It's the largest mass extinction in the history of complex animal life, the event scientists sometimes call the Great Dying, and the scale of what happened is genuinely difficult to absorb. We touched on it in episode 6 in the context of the Paleozoic Ocean, but in the context of mass extinctions, it deserves a fuller treatment, because it's the event that most clearly illustrates how close life came to being effectively erased from the planet. Around 252 million years ago, a series of volcanic eruptions began in what is now Siberia. These weren't ordinary eruptions. The Siberian traps represent one of the largest volcanic events in the history of the planet. Over perhaps a few 100,000 years, an almost unimaginable volume of lava flooded across an area roughly the size of modern Europe, releasing enormous quantities of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other gases into the atmosphere. The CO2 drove rapid global warming. The sulfur dioxide caused acid rain on a global scale. Methane released from coal beds and ocean sediments amplified the warming further. The ocean responded to this cascade of changes by becoming simultaneously hotter, more acidic, and less oxygenated. Ocean temperatures rose by perhaps 10 degrees Celsius or more in some regions. Ocean acidification dissolved the calcium carbonate shells and skeletons of the invertebrates that formed the base of the marine food web, and the warm, stratified ocean lost most of its oxygen in large parts of the water column, creating conditions that made survival impossible for most aerobic life. These three stresses hit simultaneously and reinforced each other. The result was the extinction of approximately 96% of all marine species. The trilobites, which had survived 2 previous mass extinctions and had been part of the ocean for nearly 300 million years, went completely extinct. The rugose and tabulate corals, which had built the reef systems of the Paleozoic, went extinct. The majority of brachiopod species disappeared. Groups that had seemed to be permanent features of marine life simply ceased to exist. What saved life at all was the survival of a small number of generalist species, organisms that could tolerate a wide range of conditions. These survivors were the seed bank from which the Triassic world grew. Recovery was slow. The early Triassic Ocean was a sparse, low-diversity environment dominated by a handful of opportunistic species. Complex reef ecosystems didn't recover for roughly 10 million years. The full recovery of marine diversity to something comparable to the late Permian took tens of millions of years. The Great Dying was not just the largest extinction. It was the one from which life took the longest to recover. The Great Dying also fundamentally restructured the ocean's chemistry in ways that persisted for millions of years after the extinction itself. The loss of so many calcifying organisms altered the ocean's carbonate chemistry for an extended period. The disruption of oxygen cycles in the deep ocean created conditions that are only imperfectly reflected in the geological record, because the extreme anoxia destroyed much of the organic material that would otherwise have preserved evidence of what was living and dying in those waters. Scientists studying the end Permian extinction are still finding new evidence of its severity, and each new study tends to confirm that it was even more catastrophic than previous estimates had suggested. The recovery from the Great Dying also produced some of the most important innovations in the history of the ocean. The scleractinian corals that dominate modern reef systems first appeared and began diversifying in the Triassic period following the extinction. The modern fish groups that dominate today's ocean, including the teleosts that account for roughly half of all vertebrate species on Earth, diversified substantially in the aftermath of the Permian extinction. The ammonites, which had been relatively limited before the extinction, diversified explosively in the Triassic into the hundreds of species that would define the Mesozoic ocean. The Great Dying was catastrophic, but it was also the event that most thoroughly cleared the slate for the modern marine world. The end Triassic extinction, around 201 million years ago, is in some ways the forgotten mass extinction, overshadowed by the more famous events that preceded and followed it. It eliminated roughly 80% of all species on Earth, which by any ordinary measure makes it one of the most devastating events in the history of life. But it sits between the Great Dying and the end Cretaceous extinction, which killed the dinosaurs and tends to dominate the popular imagination. As a result, it doesn't get the attention it deserves. The end Triassic extinction was caused by another episode of large-scale volcanism, this time associated with the breakup of the supercontinent Pangaea. As the land masses that would eventually become the modern continents began pulling apart, they opened a rift that would become the Atlantic Ocean. Along that rift, over a period of several 100,000 years, an enormous volume of lava erupted onto what is now the eastern seaboard of North America, the Caribbean, and the northwestern coast of Africa. The geological formation left by these eruptions is called the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, and it released enough CO2 to trigger a rapid global warming event and ocean acidification that closely parallels the mechanism of the end Permian extinction on a somewhat smaller scale. In the ocean, the end Triassic extinction hit reef communities particularly hard. The scleractinian corals, the group that builds modern reefs and that had appeared after the end Permian extinction wiped out their Paleozoic predecessors, were severely affected. Many coral lineages went extinct, and the reefs they had built collapsed. The conodonts, small eel-like animals that had been present in the ocean for over 300 million years and whose tiny tooth-like fossils are found in enormous numbers in marine sediments worldwide, went completely extinct at the end of the Triassic. The end Triassic extinction was also significant for what it cleared away on land. The archosaurs, the broad group of reptiles that included the ancestors of both dinosaurs and crocodilians, had been diversifying throughout the Triassic, but shared the land with a wide variety of other large-bodied reptiles that competed with them for ecological dominance. The end Triassic extinction preferentially eliminated many of those competitors, leaving the dinosaurs as the dominant large land animals of the Jurassic world. In this sense, the extinction didn't just destroy, it cleared the stage for the age of dinosaurs. For the ocean, the most significant long-term consequence of the end Triassic extinction was the opportunity it created for the marine reptiles. The ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, and eventually the mosasaurs rose to dominate the Mesozoic ocean in the aftermath of Triassic extinctions that had cleared out many of their competitors. The end Triassic extinction was a precondition for the extraordinary world of the Mesozoic ocean, just as the end Permian had been a precondition for the Triassic recovery that produced the animals that would inherit the Jurassic seas. The end Triassic extinction is also important for what it tells us about the relationship between volcanism and extinction. Like the Permian extinction, it was driven primarily by large-scale volcanism releasing CO2 into the atmosphere. The same basic mechanism, rapid CO2 increase leading to warming and ocean acidification, produced broadly similar results in both cases, despite the two events occurring 50 million years apart. This parallel suggests that rapid atmospheric CO2 increase is one of the most reliable extinction triggers in Earth's history, regardless of its source. That observation sits uncomfortably beside the fact that human activity is currently adding CO2 to the atmosphere faster than the volcanic eruptions that drove the Permian and Triassic extinctions. The end Triassic extinction also produced the ocean conditions that would define the Jurassic period. The warm, shallow epicontinental seas of the Jurassic, which would produce the extraordinary marine fossil record that has given scientists much of what they know about Mesozoic ocean life, developed in the aftermath of the end Triassic extinction as the rifting of Pangaea opened new ocean basins and flooded continental margins with shallow water. The geography of the Jurassic Ocean was itself a consequence of the volcanic events that drove the extinction. The end Cretaceous extinction, 66 million years ago, is the most famous of the five, partly because it killed the non-avian dinosaurs, and partly because it had a cause dramatic enough to capture the popular imagination. An asteroid, roughly 6 miles across, struck the Earth at what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, releasing energy equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons in a fraction of a second. The impact vaporized the rock at the impact site, threw enormous quantities of debris into the atmosphere, triggered massive wildfires across much of the planet, and produced a cloud of dust and soot thick enough to block sunlight globally for months to years. The result was a rapid and catastrophic collapse of food chains in both the ocean and on land. In the ocean, the end Cretaceous extinction was particularly severe for the organisms that depended on photosynthesis. Phytoplankton, the microscopic plants that form the base of almost all ocean food chains, depend on sunlight to grow. When the impact winter blocked sunlight globally, phytoplankton populations collapsed, and with them the entire marine food web that depended on them. The mosasaurs and plesiosaurs couldn't survive the collapse of their food supply. The ammonites, which had been one of the most successful and diverse groups in the Mesozoic ocean for nearly 200 million years, went completely extinct. The belemnites, another cephalopod group, also disappeared entirely. The collapse wasn't instantaneous or uniform across the ocean. Some groups were affected more severely than others, and some regions more than others. Sharks survived and went on to diversify dramatically in the extinction's aftermath. Many fish species survived. Sea turtles survived. Crocodilians survived. The selectivity of extinction in the end Cretaceous event is one of its most scientifically interesting features, because it reveals something about the qualities that allowed certain lineages to make it through when others didn't. The asteroid impact hypothesis for the end Cretaceous extinction was first proposed by Luis and Walter Alvarez in 1980, based on their discovery of an unusually high concentration of iridium, an element rare in Earth's crust but common in asteroids, in rock layers worldwide that correspond exactly to the end Cretaceous boundary. The hypothesis was controversial when first proposed. The discovery of the Chicxulub crater off the Yucatan coast in the early 1990s provided the physical evidence of the impact that had been predicted, and scientific consensus has since firmly established the asteroid as the primary cause. Though the Deccan Traps volcanism in India that was happening simultaneously likely contributed to the stress on ecosystems. The end Cretaceous extinction also offers one of the clearest examples of what ecologists call an impact winter, a rapid global cooling caused by debris blocking sunlight after a catastrophic event. The cooling that followed the Chicxulub impact was temporary by geological standards, lasting perhaps a decade before conditions began to stabilize. But a decade without photosynthesis is an eternity for any ecosystem that depends on it. The collapse of plant life on land and phytoplankton in the ocean rippled up through food chains with devastating efficiency. The end Cretaceous extinction was the last of the five, and it's the one that most directly shaped the world we live in today. The extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs cleared the ecological space that allowed mammals to diversify from the small, nocturnal creatures they had been throughout the Mesozoic into the enormous variety of forms they take today. The extinction of the large marine reptiles created the ecological space that allowed whales to return to the ocean and eventually achieve dominance. The modern world, in a very real sense, is the world that the end Cretaceous extinction made possible. The end Cretaceous extinction also had an important legacy for the ocean's microbial communities. The collapse of photosynthetic plankton during the impact winter, while devastating in the short term, was followed by a rapid diversification of plankton groups in the Paleocene epoch that followed. New lineages of foraminifera, coccolithophores, and diatoms emerged and diversified in the post-extinction ocean, and the modern plankton communities that form the base of almost all ocean food chains are the direct descendants of this post-extinction radiation. 5 times the living world has been nearly destroyed. 5 times it has survived. That survival is not random, and the patterns of who lived and who died across the 5 mass extinctions tell us something important about what it actually takes to endure when the environment collapses around you. The most consistent predictor of survival across all 5 mass extinctions is what biologists call ecological generalism. Generalist species, those that can eat a wide variety of food sources, tolerate a wide range of temperatures and water conditions, and reproduce across a wide range of environmental circumstances, consistently outperform specialists during mass extinction events. Specialists may be extraordinarily effective in stable conditions, but when their habitat disappears or their food source crashes, they have nowhere to go. The generalist, by contrast, has options. It can switch food sources, tolerate changed conditions, and wait out the crisis in ways that the specialist cannot. Geographic range also mattered enormously. Species distributed across wide areas of the ocean consistently survived mass extinctions at higher rates than those restricted to small geographic ranges. If conditions become lethal in one location, a species present in many locations can persist in those where conditions remain tolerable. Many of the groups that went completely extinct in mass extinctions were already reduced to small remnant populations confined to limited geographic ranges by the time the final blow fell. Body size turns out to be a more complicated predictor than you might expect. Large-bodied animals are generally more vulnerable during mass extinctions because they need more food, reproduce more slowly, and maintain smaller populations. The large marine reptiles, the large placoderms, the large filter-feeding ammonites all were hit particularly hard in their respective extinctions. But small body size isn't a guarantee of survival either. What mattered wasn't size per se, but the combination of size with the other factors. A small, geographically widespread, ecologically flexible species had a much better chance than a large, range-restricted specialist. There's also a pattern involving metabolic rate that runs through multiple extinctions. Animals with high metabolic rates, those that need to eat frequently to sustain their body temperature and activity level, were consistently more vulnerable than animals with low metabolic rates that could slow down and wait. This helps explain why crocodilians, sea turtles, and sharks all survived the end Cretaceous extinction while the metabolically demanding mosasaurs and plesiosaurs didn't. The ability to dramatically reduce energy consumption when food became scarce was, during the food chain collapses that followed mass extinction events, quite literally the difference between life and death. There's also a pattern involving the relationship between organisms and their environment that runs through all 5 extinctions. The organisms most vulnerable to mass extinction are often those whose environment changed most rapidly and most completely. Species adapted to warm, shallow, oxygen-rich waters were devastated by cooling and anoxia. Species adapted to stable reef environments were devastated when reefs collapsed. The lesson isn't that specialization is always a liability. It's that specialization becomes a liability, specifically when the environment changes faster than evolution can respond. The patterns of survival and extinction across the 5 mass extinctions also challenge a common assumption about natural selection, which is that the traits most advantageous under normal conditions should also be most advantageous under extreme conditions. In reality, the traits that make a species successful in a stable, competitive environment are often different from the traits that make it resilient to catastrophe. The specialist that outcompetes every generalist in normal times may be the first to go extinct when the environment shifts. This means that evolution can't fully optimize for catastrophic resilience without sacrificing some degree of normal conditions performance. Survival through a mass extinction is only the beginning. Once the catastrophic event is over and conditions begin to stabilize, the survivors face the challenge of rebuilding a functioning ecosystem from whatever pieces remain. That recovery process is one of the most fascinating aspects of mass extinction science, because it reveals how ecosystems actually work and how long genuine biological complexity takes to re-establish itself. The early phase of recovery after a mass extinction tends to be dominated by what ecologists call disaster species. Organisms that are small, reproduce quickly, can tolerate a wide range of conditions, and are capable of exploiting the disrupted, low-diversity environment that follows a catastrophe. These aren't the species that'll define the recovered ecosystem. They're the opportunists that fill the empty space while more complex ecological relationships are being re-established. In the ocean, the immediate post-extinction communities are often characterized by enormous blooms of simple organisms, bacteria, algae, and small invertebrates, growing in the absence of the predators and competitors that would normally keep them in check. The recovery of reef ecosystems is particularly instructive because reefs are among the most complex and interdependent structures in the ocean, and their recovery after each mass extinction took an exceptionally long time. After the end Permian extinction, complex reef systems didn't recover for approximately 10 million years. After the end Cretaceous extinction, the recovery of reef diversity took several million years. These long timescales reflect the fact that a reef isn't just a physical structure. It's a community of hundreds of interdependent species, each of which needs to not only survive, but re-establish the specific relationships with other species that make the reef function. Each mass extinction was followed by a period of genuine biological innovation as the surviving lineages diversified into the ecological space that the extinction had cleared. After the end Permian extinction, the scleractinian corals that built the reefs of the Mesozoic and modern ocean diversified from a few surviving lineages. After the end Cretaceous extinction, mammals diversified explosively into every terrestrial and many marine ecological niches. After each extinction, the ocean that emerged was genuinely different from the one that had existed before, populated by different groups playing similar ecological roles. When a species goes extinct, it doesn't just disappear. It takes with it all the ecological relationships it was part of, the specific parasites adapted to it, the specific predators that depended on it, the specific prey it was keeping in check. Every extinction ripples outward through the web of ecological relationships in ways that are difficult to predict and often impossible to reverse. The recovery of a single species doesn't restore those relationships. It just adds one piece back to a puzzle whose other pieces have often moved on without it. The recovery periods also illustrate something that's directly relevant to conservation biology in the present. Some groups bounced back quickly after their respective extinctions, and others recovered slowly, and the difference had as much to do with the state of the ecosystem around them as it did with their own inherent resilience. Recovery from a mass extinction is a collective process, not an individual one, and it takes as long as the slowest essential component requires. The recovery periods following mass extinctions also produced some of the most remarkable examples of convergent evolution in the history of life, cases where different lineages independently evolved similar solutions to similar ecological challenges. After the end Cretaceous extinction, mammals evolved body plans remarkably similar to those of the marine reptiles that had just gone extinct, with some lineages becoming large, torpedo-shaped open ocean predators, and others becoming filter feeders of enormous size. The ecological roles that the extinction had vacated were refilled by different animals, often with strikingly similar designs, demonstrating that the ocean's ecological structure has a logic that reasserts itself regardless of which specific lineages are available to fill it. The 5 mass extinctions are historical events separated from us by tens to hundreds of millions of years. But the science of mass extinctions has a present tense dimension that's impossible to ignore, because many scientists now argue that the Earth is in the early stages of a 6th mass extinction, driven not by volcanism or asteroid impact, but by human activity. Whether that argument is correct, and what it means if it is, are among the most important questions in contemporary science. The evidence that species are going extinct faster than normal is robust. Scientists estimate that the current rate of species extinction is somewhere between 100 and 1,000 times higher than the natural background rate. In the ocean specifically, populations of marine vertebrates, including fish, marine mammals, seabirds, and sea turtles, have declined by roughly half since 1970, according to the most comprehensive assessments. Coral reefs, which support roughly 25% of all marine species, despite covering less than 1% of the ocean floor, have lost roughly half their coral cover globally over the same period. These are not minor fluctuations. They're population collapses of a magnitude that, in the geological record, would be associated with a mass extinction event. The mechanisms driving the current biodiversity crisis are different from those of the previous 5 extinctions, but not entirely without precedent. Ocean warming parallels the warming that drove the end Permian and end Triassic extinctions. Ocean acidification parallels the acidification associated with those same volcanic events. Habitat destruction, overfishing, and pollution are additional pressures that compound the effects of the climate-related stresses in ways that make the overall picture more severe. There's genuine scientific debate about whether what's happening now qualifies as a mass extinction in the technical sense, because a mass extinction is defined by the loss of species rather than the loss of populations. And many of the species that have declined dramatically haven't yet gone extinct. Some scientists prefer to call the current crisis a mass extinction in progress. Others argue that the distinction is largely semantic. and that the collapse of populations we're currently observing is the early phase of a species loss event that will, on the timescales that mass extinction science operates, look exactly like a mass extinction. What the previous 5 extinctions tell us, clearly and unambiguously, is that recovery from a mass extinction takes millions of years. The ocean that exists today is the product of 66 million years of recovery and diversification since the last mass extinction. If we're genuinely in the early stages of a 6th extinction, the world that eventually recovers from it will be unrecognizable from the one we inhabit now, and no human civilization will be present to see it. That's not a reason for despair. It's a reason for taking the geological perspective seriously when evaluating the choices being made today. The geological perspective on mass extinction is simultaneously humbling and, in a strange way, reassuring. Humbling because it makes clear how fragile the conditions that support the current diversity of ocean life actually are. Reassuring because it demonstrates that life is extraordinarily resilient at the broadest scale, capable of surviving even events as catastrophic as the Great Dying and rebuilding complexity over time. But that reassurance comes with an important caveat. The life that survived and rebuilt after each mass extinction was not the same life that existed before. The ocean always recovered. The particular organisms, ecosystems, and ecological relationships that were lost did not. There's also a practical dimension to understanding mass extinctions that goes beyond the purely scientific. Conservation policy, international environmental agreements, and the allocation of resources to protecting biodiversity all depend in part on how decision makers understand the stakes of what's happening to the natural world. The framing of the current biodiversity crisis as a potential mass extinction is not simply a scientific claim. It's also a moral and political argument that the pace and scale of species loss demands a qualitatively different response from normal environmental change, and one that the geological record supports. 5 times in 500 million years, the ocean has nearly been emptied. 5 times it has filled again. The life that exists today, every fish and coral and whale and shark, is descended from the survivors of those 5 catastrophes, shaped by the selection pressures of extinction and recovery in ways that run through every living thing in the sea. In our next episode, we turn to one of the most remarkable substances in human history and the ocean's oldest gift to civilization, salt. How it was harvested, how it shaped trade routes and built empires, and what the ocean's salt can tell us about the history of the world. Until then, thank you for listening.